Okay, so Happy New Year, everybody. This is the first edition of Transport in the Time of COVID-19, 11th of January, another year. And email me for bits and pieces, or if you want links or the slides, and or to give me bits of information, there we go, and there's our website. Okay, so oops, there's a new Minister for Active Travel, Trudy Harrison. She replaces Chris Heaton-Harris on cycling and walking. She actually, a few weeks ago, she made some comments about how owning a car in a city was very 20th century and people should be thinking more in terms of car clubs, and that got the Daily Express all worked up. She hasn't voted for measures to address climate change, but anyway, she did make those comments and she's the new minister. Now, some important stuff on vehicle emissions from Greg Marsden. The UK had 2 million more cars by the end of the second quarter of last year than it did 6 years previously. Average CO2 emissions from new cars are a little bit more in 2021 than they were 6 years ago. In other words, a bit more. That's despite all the new electric vehicles because of the growth of SUVs, etc. That's to say, of those 2 million cars, about 1.2 are some kind of electric vehicle. So it shows that even with more electric vehicles, because of new internal combustion engines as well, the emissions aren't going down, plus emissions from electricity generation, which is not yet fully decarbonized, haven't been included. So if you included the emissions from the electricity for the electric vehicles, there'd be an even greater amount of greenhouse gas emissions from new cars. And also amongst the vans and lorries, there are more, and so that will push the emissions up even further. So he pushes the fact that there should be the grid should be expanded for more electric vehicles, but we have to have fewer cars. Fewer cars. That's from Greg Marsden. Okay, your victim blaming from tonight. This is a reporting form for Go Safe Cymru, which is the partnership of the road safety people and police in Wales, particularly South Wales, who are actually very good in starting up Operation Snap. But their form is not much good. What kind of clothing was worn? So the person who responded says, yes, clothing was worn. So lots of people do that, saying, yeah, I was wearing clothing. I normally go naked on the bike, but I was wearing clothing. So that's nice to see that. Right, now, Peel's principles. These are the principles by Sir Robert Peel, and you may wonder why I'm talking about that, but the Peelian principle number 7 is the one which has been used for third-party reporting. It was the reason why West Midlands Police with Mark Hodson and Steve Hudson started doing a lot of third-party reporting as well as the policing of close passing. And it's based on the idea that as the police are really just the police are the public and the public are the police being only members of the public who are paid to give full-time attention to duties which are incumbent on every citizen. I put that in my emphasis because it's when you get people like Cycling Mikey, who's been on Ideas with Beers, people call him a vigilante or whatever. He refers to the Peelian principle And it involves the idea that citizens not only have the right to report crimes, but it's incumbent upon them. So that's something which I thought I'd mention. Here's sort of interesting, carsplaining, when someone who never rides a bike explains road safety to cyclists, and we've all had that. And from Cycling UK, where the potential conflict that comes from a lack of awareness of the highway code, and they want to set up some form of campaigning and initiatives from government and motoring organisations to make sure that motorists are aware of the changes in the highway code, many of which are just elaborations of the highway code as it already existed. But it is something that is being pushed for by Cycling UK, and Roger will speak about that next week's edition, but it's a current hot topic. Apologies for the yellow lines everywhere. Here's a report, Science Direct. Owned e-bikes and e-scooters emit less CO2 than the modes they replace, while shared devices generate more. This finding challenges a common vision in transport that sharing is caring for the environment. This is a study based in Zurich. Owned e-micromobility tends to replace car trips, while shared devices often substitute for transit or walking. And the greenest way of doing things is owned bicycles. And here's a nice graphic from Elliot Fishman. It's the space required for each occupant of different modes, along with grams of CO2 per person kilometre travelled. That's quite an old one, but I thought I'd flash it up for you. Right, Grant Shapps did analysis saying that he was appalled at the cost of Insulate Britain protests costing taxpayer over £4 million. So I tweeted that the Department of Transport says that the cost of a fatal road traffic collision is about £10 million a day just from the fatals. Actually, the really big costs are from the slight injuries in terms of delay and increased congestion, etc. I'd be very careful about those figures because they're normally used to justify road building, motorway building. But I just thought I'd put that tweet out there, and I got a lot of likes and retweets for it. There's Police Crime and Sentencing Courts Bill, which Roger's going to speak about. And Active Travel England is, we hear behind the scenes that it's sort of getting going in various ways. And we'll hear more about that soon. New reading list, here's Cycling Mikey, had a piece on his work by Peter Walker. That's why I mentioned the Pelion principle bit. Nice article by John Vidal on the Great Green Reset in The Guardian. This from last year, how smart council officers trip up fake consultees, very important thing to read from Luke. More reading. Yes, petition on scrapping the road investment strategy doesn't seem to have got many people signing in, so you may want to go to that to join in. Are electric vehicles getting too big and heavy? This indicates that because of having big, heavy EVs, there'll be strain on the US grid. Another argument against EVs. The Green Alliance report I gave last year, the new highway code, Roger will speak about next week. These ones I've talked about before. Here, useful read by Professor Phil Goodwin, which you should have a look at from Transport Extra. How to do LTNs, I mentioned last year. Now, how not to do LTNs, not good news from London Borough of Brent. And there's a quite nice succinct blog here about a particular LTN and how it hasn't come to pass despite a lot of desire for it to happen from local residents. So if you're involved in LTNs, do read this. Course at Westminster University Active Travel Academy, and there is a webinar in a couple of days' time on delivering transport strategy in the context of decarbonisation that has Professor Gillian Annable, who's always very good speaking at it. So you may want to get on that. Okay, now news from around the UK. 20-mile-an-hour limits in Sevenoaks, that's good news. It's a plan for getting 1 in 4 cars off the roads by 2030 from Oxfordshire County Council. Will that happen? There have been lots of plans in the past. On social media, there's a bit of grumbling saying, you know, we'll believe it when we see it, kind of things. Right. Concerns about new Grey Street plan only showing one-way cycling. Some worries from campaigners in Newcastle. Be nice to hear Sally or someone else say something about that at the end. Manchester worries about the clean air zone. Andy Burnham seemed to be wobbling about that, and there was a protest of drivers doing a go slow on the motorway. Well, yes, try going slow on motorways more often, please. You know, like within the speed limit, you know what I mean? So a bit of pushback and worries about what's happening in Manchester. And Dovecote Lane in Nottingham, some restrictions on cars on a so-called racetrack. Hull, this came out on social media. What is that exactly? Not LTN 120 compliant, light blue on the inside, a cycle lane. Where is that? What is that about? Anybody from Hull, your comments will be welcome. And here's, yeah, UK capability funding. I haven't heard any more about whether reassurances have been given. If anybody's got any news, do tell me. Right, in London, yes, worries. Khan is warning that London would have more gridlock because of a shift of driving. While levels of walking and cycling have risen a bit, the overall proportion of people making sustainable journeys has fallen as a result of the collapse in numbers using public transport. Tube use is at 55%, bus use 70% pre-pandemic, and car use is back to where it was in the second half of 2021. So, you know, maybe some news from Simon about where we are with Sadiq Khan and TfL on that. As you know, TfL is in a tricky position financially. It's okay for the next couple of months, but we do have concerns about bus and tube services being cut and cuts or non-existence of active travel measures. Some comments from Simon from last year. Now, I don't want to be London-centric, and I'm just going to mention things in London really because of general relevance. But tomorrow, meeting of Lewisham Council who are saying that their Lee Green low traffic neighbourhood should be retained. Hopefully that will happen tomorrow. Oval and Railton low traffic neighbourhoods will be made permanent following consultation in Lambeth. Good news there. Merton CS7, not good news. So disappointed at latest improvements recently announced by TfL, which reintroduced danger for cyclists at some of the busiest junctions. It's not looking good in Merton. And in Brent, we have the problem of the Olive Road LTNs plus other LTNs I read today on social media. So mixed from London. Now, here's some good news. The Newham and Waltham Forest low traffic neighbourhoods, some nice numbers there. Also, this is cross-borough, 2 boroughs, so that's relevant to you, those of you who are working with more than one highway authority. So nice graphic there with some good information on Maryland and Odessa low traffic neighborhoods. Right, now I went for a bike ride down the bidirectional paths on CS9, Hammersmith and Fulham. And here's something which I think is of general relevance to all of us with regard to bidirectionals. Here's bidirectional, and I was coming up here towards the camera along here, and I got nearly right hooked by someone driving in from there, not expecting a cyclist to be coming this way, and nearly hit me there. So a question for you: what to do about right hooks at junctions like that with bidirectionals? One we've mentioned before, but it is an issue. So if anybody could say anything about that, that would be nice. In February, we'll have David Dansky, who some of you may know as one of the key figures in the cycle training movement in London for a long period of time, 20 years, anti-roads protester before that, who was badly injured about 6 months ago, and he wants to talk about specific instances with some cycle infrastructure in Camden. But here, just some questions about possible engineering solutions there. And finally, Desmond Tutu, did he say this thing? Give a man a fish and feed him for a day, teach a man to fish and feed him for a lifetime, teach a man to cycle and he will realize fishing is stupid and boring. Good old Desmond Tutu. Oh yeah, something else. French car adverts must proclaim benefits of walking or cycling. And finally, something from Poland, a nice graphic there. Okay, so any comments, please?
Thanks, Bob. Shall I go first and just say something about Newcastle, and then we'll open up to see if anyone else has got comments? Yeah, so we received an email with a plan for the sort of the latest proposal for Grey Street, and it has one-way traffic southbound. It has very wide pavements on both sides and some planting, but it has no northbound cycling. So we kind of got in touch with the council. We've spoken to officers, and I think it's kind of quite an important test, really, of the active travel fund and how effective it's going to be. For those of you who are in London, you probably won't really understand how funding elsewhere in the country works, but in the past you can bid for money for cycling. You can do something which doesn't really help cycling that much, and there isn't necessarily going to be, well, there isn't, I think, really usually a comeback. So I think local authorities are very used to bidding for money and then using it in whatever way they can, and then saying, well, this is what we did with it. And in the bid for Grey Street, they were very clear that this was going to be a flagship scheme for the Active Travel Fund. It was going to have two-way cycling and all of the other sort of, all of the other great things they were going to include in the street, which are really important on this. And it's a really, it's a really important street. And it's kind of hard to know how we've got where we are. There's 19 meters building to building here. There's one-way traffic, so it doesn't take, you don't have to be that great at maths to figure out there's quite a lot of space to play with, but obviously there's still quite a lot of different demands on that space. So we've put in our response and I think a number of other people too, raising sort of this, how alarming this is, because it does cut off. There's already a lot of one-way streets in that part of the city, and what they should be doing is making those streets two-way, not kind of further reducing options, but it does really cut off a link from the city centre to the quayside, for example, for us, which is a really important link for cycling. And it sort of throws up as well, like this difference between what is making a street accessible for cycling and what's part of the cycle network, because I think there's sort of some theory that they could put cycling on another street, which wouldn't have the same effect. You need to be able to cycle on both of those streets, and they have that, but they are quite different in terms of, you know, accessing different destinations. So yeah, I think, I mean, in terms of the active travel fund, I think really this sort of, you know, if this goes through and cycling it does end up only being one way, so there's reduced cycling on the street, but arguably increased pedestrian space, although I think a lot of it will end up being cafe space. Is that something that is going to be acceptable, or what will happen? What will happen? Is there going to be any scrutiny? So yeah, and Newcastle has, you know, to their credit, they have kept in all of their temporary or experimental schemes to date. They are just about to come up to the 18-month mark on the 5 point closures they made, 2 of which create low traffic neighbourhoods. So we're all really hoping that they're made permanent, but it does sort of start to question a lot of the pledges that they've made. They have a really good net zero policy. They have, you know, some pretty good transport policies. So really this is a bit of a test of, has this happened because it's sort of just been watered down incrementally, and then if somebody said, oh, we can't fit that in anymore, or really is it that, you know, the whole thing was just sort of bike washing, and sort of, you know, there wasn't necessarily a strong intention to provide that cycling there. And that's probably all I've got to say on that. Who can I see hands up from? I think Mark Strong, did you have your hand up first? Have you got something to add or to ask over?
Thanks. Yeah, just a couple of things. On the Active Travel Fund, Capability Fund, so it's now August, September, October, November, December, 5 months since bids were submitted. I gather that next week it might be announced, but that's for the Capability Fund. One of the councils I'm working with told me, but they don't want it publicised who they had a 40% cut. We know that Brighton had a 25% cut. But the others have still not been announced unless anyone knows better. So it's not very good to expect councils to put bids in and then just sit around waiting for nearly half a year to know what they're going to do. And the next round is going to come along very soon, and they're going to end up hitting each other because they won't know what to do with the money they've got. And we know councils are not spending the money that they got from an Active Travel Fund too. So that's the first side of things. And if anyone's on that council list, they should be putting an FOI in to, I don't know if Bob can put it back up, but if anyone's from those areas, they should be FOIing their own council. I mean, anyone can do it, but it's better if you're local to try and find out what's actually happened to their bid. On bidirectional tracks, I think it's horses for courses, and obviously places like seafronts, promenades, riversides, which don't have any side roads, they work really well. So I think some roads don't have any side road junctions. So I think it's not as clear cut as with flow, and being with flow good and bidirectional bad. I'll leave it there.
Thanks, Mark. David Harrison, you got a hand up?
Oh yeah, hi. I was really fascinated by the study of shared ownership, because it seems so counterintuitive, its studies, that here in Islington and Hackney, where we have very low car use, cars sit on the street for most of the year, and you only see them when they've gone to their second homes in the Christmas, disappearing from the street. So it seemed that switching car ownership to car sharing would be, use of zip cars and things, would actually decrease use. And so I was surprised by the study. Obviously, there are huge other advantages in ending car ownership, in that the streets then become available for parklets, rain gardens, cycle lanes, and all sorts of fabulous things. And just a second point, so I've been fascinated by people's reactions. And a second thing is just to tell everybody, I'll put it in the chat, that Walking at Tea Time is back next week on the 20th of January, where we'll be studying the development of a walking industry to see whether we can develop a vision of the walkable city to rival that of the car industry. Well, it might take a while to do that, but please join us.
Thanks, David. That sounds great. Tim Felby, I think you had your hand up.
Thank you, Sally. It's Tim Phoebe. Happy New Year, everyone. The whole scheme is an interesting one. I audited that for the English Region Cycling Development Team in 2003. It was the first time I'd seen a cycle lane by the curb with a buffer zone of hatching, which you can see on the photo it burnt off, and created a parking lane, and then the cycle lane, and then a traffic lane on what was a dual carriageway. Andy Mayo did it, so I thought it was a really good scheme. I hadn't seen anything like that in 2003. And Unfortunately, they have gone backwards on that one, and I saw quite a lot of tweets calling it a murder lane. So I put that in the chat. That was Road CC. But in other places on that road, they've actually put ones in where the hatching is. So there's some improvements and some, but that bit is not good, I don't think, because you'll get cars, you'll get doored in it. You could have people crossing you to get in and out of the parking lane. So it's not really going to encourage cycling. And when they put the lanes in and took the traffic lane out, they got a big increase in cycling back in the day, but we're expecting a bit more now. So just a bit of historical interest for folks, some of the younger Zoomers out there. Thank you.
Thanks, Tim. Sorry, I haven't got my glasses on. I'm kind of can't see anybody's names probably. I'm just going to move on to Adam, and then I think we'll move on because sorry, Ruth, and is it Dave? You got hands up, but I think we need to move on to speakers.
Yeah, just a quick comment on when people talk about scooters and how they reduce walking. That argument also goes, then we shouldn't really reduce the cost of public transport, because when the price of buses goes down, people stop walking. So I think this idea that e-scooters are unhealthy or whatever, they are still what I call a form of public transport. It's a mass form of transport because of the density it can use at. And we should be very careful about using this idea that e-scooters reduce walking, because that argument can end up in some very bad places in terms of moving active travel schemes forward. Yeah, I can see. So this is just a comment on what was said earlier.
Thanks, Adam. I know that some research here has shown that the e-scooters have shifted quite a few car journeys to e-scooters. I don't know. I could dig that out, Bob, if you've not covered that before. Right, I think we'll move on. We've got Simon next, Simon Munk, who's going to talk about, sorry, I got that wrong, critical friend campaigning. Do you want to share your screen? I presume you want to share slides, Simon.
Yeah, if that's okay. Which I'll just do now. So hopefully you can all see that. I'm going to rattle through this.
Hang on. No, we haven't got. We've got that you've started screen sharing, but we haven't got. Oh, there we go. It's up now.
Look at that. Wonderful, the wonders of Zoom. So just I'll rattle through slides. They're really just there to remind me what to say at various points, because my brain at this time of night is generally out of my ears and down on the floor. So I'm going to talk briefly about critical friend, what it means to be a critical friend, and how it relates to campaigning. And I guess this is really kind of born out of my frustration and grumpiness, which is generalized and probably legendary. But about kind of some of the folks we get on Ideas with Beers who are participants, some of the chat we get, some of the kind of stuff that goes on. When you know schemes are terrible and evil and they're going to kill everyone, or when politicians are terrible and evil and they're not going to do anything, etc., which is all very understandable, and I've been there myself many times, but also isn't necessarily very helpful. This is all very much in my opinion, as it says at the bottom. This isn't the formal policy position of the LCC, and I am the campaigns manager at London Cycling Campaign, and I'm also someone, for those who don't know me, I was very heavily involved in Waltham Forest's Mini Holland schemes, and I will probably trade on that for the rest of my life. But I guess really this slide is partly to say, why on earth should you listen to me, yet another balding white bloke in Lake Malaysia? And it is probably because arguably I have got quite a good track record of winning over politicians and delivering schemes. But really, you know, all of this is in the context of this is my thoughts and opinions on quite a lifetime of community campaigning, but the last 15 years, 10 years of campaigning, first on the Waltham Forest stuff and then regionally on London. But do with it as you will, take from it what you want. So of course, oh yeah, there we go. So is that right? I'm just going to, yeah, that is the first one. So one of the things that we come across, and I think this is, if I remember right, this might well actually be Royal College Street. I'm not sure in its original bi-directional format. If it isn't, it is a bi-directional track within the semi-distance, a side road crossing, as well as a bus stop. And these kind of schemes, when they come up, there is this constant kind of, you can't do it like that, that's terrible, or you can do it like that, or it's great, or it's whatever. And at LCC, we've had to kind of think about this repeatedly, about what is the line that you draw as a campaigner as to when these schemes work and when they don't work, when you should support them, when you should oppose them. And it kind of came down in our heads, I think, and this is developed over time, to a series of questions that are quite simple. And they're not questions like, does it conform to LTN 120's funding guidance? Does it have a 70+ CLOS score and no critical fails? Would any junctions in it have only green and orange junction assessment tool scores, etc., which is now, theoretically the formal, the bar for schemes in England for funding from the DFT, and in London we have the cycle route quality criteria. But these schemes, very rarely hit at the moment. Very rarely hit those criteria. I can't think of many schemes in England that would currently meet the DFT's own funding criteria for funding. Yet schemes get funded all the time, and we roll on. So we kind of had to get to a point of saying, below that bar, what is the bar to accept schemes? And we ask ourselves, will this scheme get loads more people cycling and walking? Are there any critical safety issues? And if there are, will they destroy the scheme entirely, or are they just something that needs fixing? Does the scheme make the route safer for current users? So even if it won't get loads more people cycling, will it make the people who are currently cycling or walking in that area much safer? Is it good value for money? Sometimes we've found that it's actually a good thing to say yes to a scheme and support a scheme if it's really, really cheap. And represents a shift for the council, even if it isn't a great scheme, but it's just a good or an okay scheme. Is it a big leap for the borough? Does this represent in your council a shift from never having done protected tracks to doing protected tracks, even if those protected tracks make you rather nervous and turn your knees to jelly? Do the benefits outweigh the risks? And I guess that's fundamentally at its root. Is this a step forward or is it a step backwards? And I guess, all of this relates to, what we show councillors and officers. Do we show them love or do we show them hate? And I think this was one of the things that I kept thinking about, is that we and I was talking to someone today about this, councillors in London, we have seen decades worth of progress in a year and a bit. And what does the post bag, the email in tray of the average councillor in London who is in a ward where one of these schemes is, or is a deputy leader for transport or whatever, portfolio holder for transport, what does their email bag look like? It looks like a wall of hatred. And then the cycling campaigners locally come along, or walking campaigners or active travel campaigners or whatever, and they then add to that hate. They say, well, this scheme is a bit rubbish. You've not done this junction right. You've not done here right. It's going to kill someone. And actually, that reaction to councillors just means that all they hear is more anger, more hate, more criticism. And so I think you have to be really careful, and I always advise our local groups to temper any criticism they have, that critical part of critical thread, with a lot of friendship. And this applies online as well. In fact, I get told off by local campaigners in Waltham Forest quite often who are brilliant at this stuff. And one of the campaigners said to me recently, do not be tempted to comment on someone posting on the local Walthamstow Facebook group who is basically hating on a scheme that's going in right now. Don't be tempted to comment on their thing. Start a new post that's how great that scheme is, and push their post down the scroll, down the screen. And that's the thing, is when you react to, and I do this all the time, so I am throwing stones in glass houses, but when you react to other people around you angrily, when you attack, as I've seen, You know, I've commented very, very, you know, gently to a disabled, you know, person about their statement about crossing, and I commented very gently, and then got piled on behind me by loads of people who follow me, who, you know, all started being really angry at that person. I'm just like, this is someone disabled who has had a really bad experience with the crossing, don't agree with their experience. And I think the conclusion they've drawn is wrong. But do you know what? I've just trolled them effectively. And that really is not a nice thing for me to have done. And I should have been a lot smarter about that. And, you know, I'm guilty of doing that. But I think far too many of us are. Far too many of us react with anger to the people around us who hate LTNs, who hate cycle tracks, whatever, and we feed their hate back with hate, and actually that doesn't help us. And councillors see this stuff online. The people in power see this stuff online. Similarly, I've written here, what can you genuinely do to hurt? I've had conversations with cycling campaigners in London and active travel campaigners in London, where they say, you know, what can we do to remove Councillor X from post? And I'm like, you know, and in fact, Mark, I'm going to call you out, Mark's wrong. Mark in the chat put you know, bro, there's a councillor, he's linked to a Twitter thing, and he said this guy is never going to change. He's unreachable.
You don't know me genuinely, honestly. He's a developer. You honestly, I would never say that about almost everyone, but genuinely.
Yeah. So I'm going to take your response there, which is genuinely this guy's unchangeable. Okay. So we want to get rid of him. How do we get rid of him? How do we hurt him? How do we genuinely, if we can't help him find the right way forward, how do we actually hurt him badly enough that we can achieve change out of this? And the simple answer, and I've said this to groups, is we can't, not easily, you know, and most active travel campaigners are far too nice and middle class to ever really actually hurt someone in a meaningful way. So what can we do if we attack councillors of a certain stripe, of a certain approach, who hate these schemes, and we go on Twitter and we're like, you're wrong and you're an idiot and you're evil and everything you've said is lies and blah, 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 blah. What are we actually going to do to that person? Are we going to make them change their mind? Are we going to make them go quiet? Or are we going to just make them double down on what they're saying and go, you know what, those evil cycling fanatics are out to get me again, and they've just reinforced my worldview? In a similar vein, it's always worth thinking about what strapping on the pom-poms costs you. You know, I've had to do this several times in my career as a campaigner, as it were, particularly with Waltham Forest, something I don't talk about a lot, but when we won the bid for Waltham Forest, some things happened very early on that were genuinely very scary. And one of the people involved in the Waltham Forest council schemes and the bid side of things at the time basically tried to dismantle everything. And the council, you know, they had a big internal battle, and one of the things we had to do was Paul Gasson, who's well known as being one of the other campaigners at Waltham Forest, and I sat down with this person and said, look, you know, we don't agree with you. What you're going to do is dreadful, but if you start winning awards, which is what you clearly care about, if you start delivering at schemes that we can, you know, we'll smile, we'll stand next to you, we'll cheerlead you. And that person, for as long as they were at Waltham Forest Council, and they are no longer there, so it's not the person that somebody might think it is, but as long as they were there, we did, whenever they won an award and we got a chance to stand up on stage and smile next to that person, we did, and we were always full of praise for that person while they were there at Waltham Forest. Sometimes you have to strap on the pom-poms, even if it hurts a bit, even if you don't like it, and say, this is brilliant, well done, keep going, do more, this is great, cheerlead like crazy, even if you don't feel like it. But the other thing in all of this, and this is really so important, is what does trust look like? Now, I always say to campaigners in London, when you've got the mobile number and you're having WhatsApp conversations or whatever with councillors or officers, that's what trust looks like. But trust looks like a two-way street where you start being able to have a critical conversation where you say, you know what, I think you're wrong on this bit. And they say, okay, well, I hear you on that. Don't necessarily agree with you, but I hear you. And we're going to have a conversation about that. Trust does not look like either never being able to criticize anything, nor, on the other hand, just being completely critical all the time and go, you're wrong, you're terrible, you're evil. No one trusts anyone who just does that to you. So I think it's a really important conversation, and I keep having it internally with myself. I keep having it with my groups, and I keep seeing this stuff coming up on Ideas with the Bid. So I wanted to really just, you know, say very clearly that in that critical friend conversation, you know, when you're having conversation with people you're seeking to influence, it's got to be 90% of it has got to be positive, you know, at least. So how to win friends and influence people, I constantly talk about this. What motivates people, what makes them tick? You know, counsellors aren't incredibly well paid. Mostly they're not chiseling huge amounts of money down their trousers by and large. So what do they get into this game for in the first place? You know, and it for 95% of them, no matter which political party they come from, they got in for a reason, and it's something to do with their community. It could be pride, it could be greed, it could be awards, it could be fear, it could be all sorts of other emotions. But you can tap into those emotions and find them, and you can tap into those motivations and find them. So do your research, you know, go on LinkedIn, look at voting records, look at public statements, look at Twitter feeds, work out what make people tick, and then align what you're trying to do to that. Try stuff out. This is a classic example of, you know, like we've had cases, there's a borough in Islington where there was a cabinet lead on transport who only ever talked about social justice. And so we aligned everything to do with cycling. The local cycling campaign produced a leaflet about what the social injustices of car domination were and what the social justice outcomes for cycling were, etc. Didn't land at all. But then we noticed that very same politician also never missed a trick to get into the local paper. So we started producing things to get them into the local paper every couple of weeks. And that worked immediately. And that council started delivering schemes soon afterwards. So try different things. If it doesn't work, try something else. Look at people's deeds, not their words. Gain trust. So we told you is quite a powerful, if a bit negative kind of approach to things. When early on in Waltham Forest, we had one of the schemes, the village scheme. And when they did the trial, Paul again and I said, there is a giant, you've left a giant rat run in the middle of the scheme, it's going to be horrible. And they said, no, it's be fine, it's two securities, etc. And then we went out and, you know, shot video and walked officers along the street and said, yes, it's really not working very well. To their credit, in the final scheme, they then fixed that rat run pretty much. But we said at the time, you know, we did warn you about this thing, you didn't listen to us, now it happened. We did tell you, next time, will you listen to us? Don't be ideological. You know, we've just had in the chat a whole bunch of things about bidirectional tracks, with people saying bidirectional tracks are fundamentally dangerous. There is actually an academic evidence base for bidirectional tracks about how dangerous they are compared to with flow tracks, compared to nothing. Yeah, and the simple answer is bidirectional tracks internationally are much safer than nothing. They are not as safe as with flow tracks, but you don't kick a bidirectional track if that's all you're going to get out of you know, your borough, your council, if that's the way they're going, etc. Don't get too caught up on the junction design that you favour, which I've seen over and over again. If the council are determined to deliver a junction, even if it's not as good as your design, but if it's still okay, then just bend with the wind a bit and be constructive. I think that's my entire thing, and I don't know how many minutes I am, but hopefully that's enough. Sally.
Great, thanks very much, Simon. Lots to think about there. Has anyone got any questions or comments for Simon? No. Well, perhaps there's been Claire, go for it.
I think people probably just need a bit of time to think. There's definitely lots to talk about there.
I just see you with such a fact blast that you're all stunned into silence.
Yeah. No, I was going to make more of an observation actually, which was, I mean, in Manchester, for instance, you know, I agree with so much of what you've said, but I think what we found in Manchester is effectively, until you've got a channel of communication, you can't really do anything. And there are some councils where there isn't even a channel of communication. So there's almost like a kind of, you know, I feel like there's a sort of, what do you do when you're in the step before where you are, when you haven't even got a channel of communication, which is a not very nice place to be. So yeah, but just to say, yeah, really support a lot of what you've said, and I think that building trust point, and some of the things that I've done recently that I found have really worked are things like made connections. I've introduced a councillor to someone else who knows more than me, and the words haven't come out of my mouth, they've come out of someone else's mouth who've known more. And so I guess that's building on your sort of what does trust look like point. That councillor has trusted me to go with my recommendation for a meeting. And I've trusted that that connection can happen without me in it. So yeah, I'm sure there are lots of other points now. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with a lot of what you said too, Simon. I think one of the things that I would say was slightly different is I think rather than that love-hate, take all that, you need to take the emotion out of it. So we're really disappointed at the latest plans that we were really, really hopeful for. We don't think it's like a conspiracy against cycling, but it's got there through somebody's logical process, and it's kind of just come out with like an answer that's really the wrong answer for cycling. And I think it's like, even if you don't have really an amazing communication, it's still possible to always be expressing what you think critically about something without being emotional about it. I think, and that is kind of what you were trying to say, I think. But it is that, not making it personal. And take some more questions. Sylvia.
If I could just jump in on that, I think it's really important to use emotion when you need to and take it out when you need to, as it were. So use it as a tool. So what motivates people is, I think, generally quite often not very logical and can be very emotional. And so you can motivate people with emotion, but you need to be very careful using it. And most of the time, as you say, take it out.
Thanks, Simon. Sylvia, do you want to say?
Hi, yeah, thank you. So yes, I do agree with everything you said, Simon. I mean, we've discussed that many times, and I think this is the right approach. I just wonder, because your experience with Wealth Forest, I mean, since then we've got social media, we've got Nextdoor, and I wonder how much it does impact on the whole thing, because even if you do have a good working relationship with some key councillors or key member of a cabinet, then they also have to kind of, I think they do get some hit from other councillors putting on more pressure. It's really because it's not just a single relationship between campaigners and one or two key councillors. It's also everybody else at the back of that councillors who I found it really difficult, because we've tried everything that you said, we've tried, and it just didn't work. I'm in Brent. I mean, I'm campaigning in Brent, and we've just basically lost all the LTN, and we followed to the letter the kind of approach. So I don't know. It's really difficult.
So if you don't mind, a couple of observations. One is, as I said, try something different. If it's not working, try other things, and that's absolutely, and I think one of the things in Brent particularly is, I do think you've got some wins there, not wins on the ground in terms of schemes, but you have a councillor who's in portfolio who's actually, I think, really genuinely very supportive, but she's isolated. So you've got to then think, okay, we've got one, but that's not enough. How do we get the others? How do we move on, etc.? So, it is always a case of just keep trying and trying and trying and different things. I think on social media, yeah, the noise is louder now, and that's in a way reinforces Sally's point. When everyone else is screaming and running around, like having lost their heads, the calm voice cutting through can be really powerful. And just, keep trying.
I've asked everybody if you could put questions in the chat, and I'll try and summarize them quickly for Simon. Otherwise, we're not going to have time for Roger. But somebody has said, do we spend too much time talking to and about councillors and officers? I'm not.
Sally, could we have actually got a councillor on the call in Paul Drake Davis. You might not have seen his comment in the chat.
No, I've got that, yeah.
I wondered if he would comment on that.
Paul, are you there still at the meeting?
While we're waiting for Paul, I was just going to say councillor, not officers. Officers, while they can be brilliant or bad or whatever, they fundamentally have to follow the agenda of the councillor. If you don't have the councillors on board, you can have great officers, rubbish, rubbish councillors.
I've got to disagree with that, Simon. I've got to fundamentally, officers gatekeep what councillors see.
Yes.
So unless you have unless you have councillors who know what they're doing, sorry to butt in, unless you have councillors who are interested and know what they're doing, they don't know that what they're being given is rubbish. So,
but unless you have councillors who know what they're doing, you're not going to get any schemes anyway because they don't want anyone to do anything.
That's possibly true, but there are well-meaning councillors who are swayed by not well-meaning officers, and vice versa.
I've got to come in here, Claire, because the comment, I used to get given letters that I had written by civil servants, people in various organisations that couldn't write the letter. And I've just been running a little poll on bike to work schemes where some certain civil servants only get the bare £1,000, and yet doing a straw poll across the country, some people are getting 3,000, 5,000, even more than £5,000 assistance in bike to work. So there's some very hard done by civil servants there. So we've got a campaign to do a straw poll that. And the letters you get invited to write can be very useful.
I think we're going to have to move on to Roger. Sorry that I know we haven't even picked up on half of that. So I think this is probably just something we're going to have to return to and have a proper discussion. Spend a bit more time discussing another week. So we'll make time for that. But we did have somebody who is a councillor here, but I can't.
Hi, can you hear me?
Oh yes, I can hear you.
Yeah, it's
Hi,
Paul here. Hi, how you doing? So I joined this conference. I got sent this link by someone on Twitter, so I've just joined in late and I missed a question that was asked of me. I was just stepped out. So can anyone remember what it was, and I'll try and answer it.
Simon, do you want to pick that up?
Well,
spend too much time talking.
Yeah, guilty. It was Rob's mention of Hull and everybody's discussion of Hull, because Paul was the one who was mentioning.
We've now lost Dave's voice. Shall I try and praise you? So I think the question, if I remember right, was very much about who has the power to make change and who should campaigners be focusing on, councillors or officers. Was that right?
Okay, right. Yeah. So I'd say there's a missing cohort in that, and I'd say residents, because what we found in Hull is people who don't understand the changes are mostly residents. Officers kind of do. A lot of councillors do, but what I've been trying to do, and it might sound a bit weird, but I helped set up, before we started any cycle work, and I helped set up a lobby group. Because I've done a lot of reading about it, and I found you need to win the public over. So what I decided to do is try and set up a lobby group and then move away from it and get the public to take it over to try and win a public PR campaign with residents. Because I think people just in Hull, I don't know if it's different in other councils, but I mean, if the council tell the public to do something, they just go no. They don't want to hear from the council because they've just got a really bad relationship with people at Hull and the council. So councillors doing it, council doing it, it comes up against resistance. So what I want to try and do is get the people on board, and as I say, take the people with you, and it's just selling that the benefits and all the positives to the residents, and then get them to accept the changes, because what we're seeing here is it's just because the way it's been done and attempted to be rolled out, it's just got massive resistance against it, and it's kind of almost set us back. It's made the job harder now because it's starting from zero, and now we've gone back to -2 in the PR battle. And I think a big part of it is selling the benefits of cycle infrastructure, the lifestyle that can bring, examples from the Netherlands, etc., etc. And if you can get that right, then you're going to get more willingness to accept change and inconvenience and all the other things that residents moan about. And then depending on what council it is, if it's a council where you've got 97 Labour or 97 Conservatives, they don't have much resistance to, not really scared of residents complaining, but where it's a bit more on the edge, then the councillors are going to listen to what residents are telling them. If they get angry about things, they're going to be resistant to it.
Thanks, Paul. I think that was a really valuable contribution, and I think Claire's mentioned in the chat is that's the role of campaigning as well, to try and kind of show there's that support. Claire, I'm going to hand over to Claire now because I'm going to have to shoot off soon, and she's going to introduce Roger.
Yes, and I'm just looking for the box in which Roger is in, checking he's here. But yeah, Roger Geffen, who's the
policy director at
Cycling UK. And we heard from him briefly before Christmas on the latest in road crime and sentencing. And we've asked him back to give us a bit more of a briefing, because there's actually a key window here for Roger, but also perhaps with some of your thoughts to influence, hopefully, how this review, happens. And obviously we know that, like, making the road safer, road crime is one of the big ways that can help. It's not just about infrastructure. So I will hand to you, Roger. And thanks, Sally, for chairing. And Sally will be leaving soon, and I'll finish up the meeting. We'll have Roger, then questions, and then we will finish with Ruth's last word.
Good, thank you, Claire, and thank you everybody. Yes, for those who were around just before Christmas, we scored a little bit of a quiet victory, whose significance will probably only sort of play out over time. The government eventually conceded, after much badgering, that they should do the thing that they originally promised to do back in 2014, namely to carry out a review of road traffic offences and penalties. Now, we didn't make huge big public noise celebrating this, because it would have obviously provoked the reaction. Why are you getting so excited about the government promising to do something they'd already promised to do 7 years ago? The difference, though, is that this time we got there through by mobilising a lot of other organisations, the RAC, as well as the road safety organisations, but also mobilising a whole load of support in both houses of Parliament. And the government has actually started on scoping out the review. So I think it's much less likely now that this time that they could just kick it into the long grass, as they did the last time we thought we'd made this bit of progress back in 2014. Let me just give a go back for those who haven't heard this before, with apologies for those who have. Quick potted history of this issue, what it's all about, why it matters. But I think the main thing that you want me to kind of get to is, so what happens next? So the potted history, you go back a long way. We started working on this whole issue of road traffic offences and penalties and what's wrong with it all and how the system needs overhauling. I was doing work on it back in 2007. We set up a road justice campaign in 2011, 2012, sometime around then. It was, with hindsight, it was a bit of an overly complex campaign. It was trying to deal with what's wrong with roads policing, with the definitions of road traffic offences and penalties, with the sentencing, with the jury, there's so many. It was such a complicated campaign. With hindsight, it was probably over complex. However, it did result in Chris Grayling, when he was Justice Secretary back in 2014, promising that he would carry out a full review of road traffic offences and penalties. We went hallelujah, and then started asking, so when is it going to happen? What's the scope of the review going to be? And it fairly quickly became clear, because there'd been a reshuffle soon after that. Dominic Raab was, I think, his successor as Justice Secretary, and that ministers were getting cold feet about this idea of a full review of road traffic offences and penalties. So in 2016 through into 2017, the Ministry of Justice carried out a much more limited consultation on just 3 proposals, rather than the full review that we thought that they signed up to back in 2014. The proposals they consulted on were, firstly, to increase the maximum penalty for 2 offences from 2 of the most serious offences, from 14 years in prison to life imprisonment. Those 2 offences being causing death by dangerous driving and causing death by careless driving while under the influence. The second has always been seen as kind of equivalent to causing death by dangerous driving. But while I talk about this, please bear in mind, in all of these offences, am I talking about death or serious injury, and am I talking about dangerous or careless driving? The significance of those will become apparent as I go through. So those 2 offences, those 2 things that they wanted to increase from 14 years to life, just to repeat, causing death by dangerous driving and causing death by careless driving while under the influence. Both of those were and probably still are to be increased from 14 years to life. At the same time, they were going to introduce a new offence of causing serious injury by careless driving. That currently doesn't exist. Well, we and Road Peace and others all thought, it's all very well increasing causing death by dangerous driving for 14 years to life, but the courts hardly ever go anywhere near 14 years at present. Probably the main reason is because causing serious injury by dangerous driving, by equally bad driving, still carries a maximum penalty of just 5 years. The only difference is whether the dangerous driving causes death or serious injury, which is probably nothing to do with the driving itself. It's likely to be sort of the luck of the draw, frankly, whether it causes the victim to be killed or maimed. And creating an even larger gap between causing the maximum the maximum penalty for causing death and causing potentially very serious injury, the courts are going to still be very reluctant to use that maximum penalty if they're just sitting there thinking, but what would the maximum penalty be if this had merely led to the victim being maimed? I know merely in inverted commas, obviously. So that's just one of the main problems here. The other thing that it would do by increasing, causing death by dangerous driving from 14 years to life, it means that any driver who is involved in a fatal collision has a far greater incentive to argue that their driving was merely careless. If they are also at the same time introducing a new offence of causing serious injury by careless driving, that will drop the threshold between what is dangerous and what is careless driving. That happened when they did this for fatal offences. They introduced the offence of causing death by careless driving, contrary to our campaigning and that road piece back in 2008. What happened was over the next 2 years, there was a 50% reduction in the number of prosecutions and convictions for causing death by dangerous driving. Mm. And if we're at risk of the same happening here for serious injury rather than fatal offences, then that's just going to add to the downward pressures on the border between what's dangerous and what's careless. So this is at risk of going backwards rather than forwards, despite appearing well-intentioned. And then there was a whole load of other problems that these three offences were just still not dealing with. Still no offence for causing serious injury, rather than death while under the influence. Still a huge gap between the offences for the penalties for causing death and serious injury, as I mentioned earlier. Still a woefully inadequate penalties for hit and run offences, or to give it the correct title, fail to stop and report offences in cases where you're leaving someone for dead in the road rather than merely scratching somebody's wing mirror in a car park. Not dealing with fatal car dooring. So there was a whole list of other issues that were just not in the legislative framework. But the fact is that the government had tabled some legislation, so it was an opportunity for us to sort of effectively throw spanners in the works by tabling a whole load of amendments that really forced the debate, and gave us opportunities to mobilise support around these issues in both the Commons and the Lords. I won't go through blow by blow on how we got there, but eventually things came to a head when we had two things within a week of each other. The Lords report stage, which is probably the most detailed debate, but the most detailed debate in the passage of a parliamentary bill is Lords report stage. That came within 1 week of a debate in the Commons, prompted by two parliamentary petitions, both of which had attracted over 100,000 signatures, tabled by families of victims the families of people who'd been killed by hit and run drivers. And the fact that those two things came so close together eventually caused the government to sort of at first acknowledge that they were considering a review of road traffic offences and penalties, and then in the second one, the petition debate in the Commons, to confirm that they were actually at work on scoping the review. Hallelujah, as I say, we finally got the government to do something, to start work on something they promised to do back in 2014. So the next bit is to learn a bit of one of the lessons from our Highway Code campaign. Once we got the government to agree to a review of the Highway Code, Joe Irvine, who was then the chief executive of Living Street, said, right, we need to start working out we shouldn't wait for the government to come out with its proposals. Let's work up our own proposals and take them round all the motoring groups and everybody else who might have a view on this stuff, and try as far as we can to go to the government with a set of proposals that we can say, look, actually, there's pretty broad agreement, at least on the scope of the review, if not the outcome of the review. So that's the next thing I'm wanting to do, is to try and effectively draft the scope of the review for the government, so that we've saved them a lot of work and they come up with the right answer. So some of the things that I'm hoping that the motoring groups, as well as us, will agree should be within scope. Well, firstly, there are a bunch of things that you won't be surprised to hear, because we Cycling UK have been banging on about throughout this campaign: the distinction between careless and dangerous driving, the sentences associated with those, and particularly the greater use of driving bans. And I'll just dwell on those first 2 points before continuing with the rest of the list of things I think we need to include within the scope. But this issue of the definitions and the associated penalties for those core offences of careless and dangerous driving, including their equivalents for causing death and for causing serious injury, and for causing either of those while under the influence. There are two ways in which this could be done. Well, actually, there's a third way. You could just eliminate the idea that there is a distinction between dangerous and careless, or any kind of more serious and less serious offence, and just say it's negligent driving. After all, theft can be everything from nicking a sweet in a sweet shop through to the sort of, a multi-billion pound jewellery heist. It's all one offence. So the idea that all of that is left to the sentencing guidance is legally possible, but I suspect it would be politically very, very unpalatable. And therefore, I'm kind of not treating that option very seriously. The other two more serious options is either we stick with broadly the current approach to the definitions of dangerous and careless driving, which are in theory supposed to be unrelated to the state of mind of the driver. The state of the mind of the driver was the distinction between reckless and careless driving prior to 1991. The difficulty with the pre-1991 legal framework was, how do you prove a reckless state of mind in court to the criminal standard? In other words, beyond reasonable doubt. Yeah. So the law was reformed in 1991 to take out state of mind. The trouble is, they still left the word careless in the definition of the lower tier offence. And careless to any, in common parlance, is a state of mind. So this has caused courts and jurors confusion ever since. Dangerous driving is supposed to be driving that has caused danger of serious, of injury or property damage, that ought to be obvious to a careful and competent driver. As I say, nothing to do with the state of mind of the driver. Careless driving should therefore be driving that falls below, but not far below, the standard of a careful and competent driver, and not so far below as to cause danger that would have been obvious to a careful and competent driver. That's how it ought to work. But the fact that the lower tier is called careless means that jurors who are partly thinking, do I really want to convict this person who's made a mistake I could imagine myself making there, but for the grace of God go I? No, I think I'd rather convict them for careless and not send them to prison. That is my guess as to what jurors are thinking. Unfortunately, the law prevents anyone from researching what jurors actually think. So we don't really know what causes jurors to do the things that they do. We can only speculate. My hunch is that we could go down one of those two routes. We can either make sure that the law works for something that actually is based on the state of mind of the driver. I suspect that jurors would prefer that. Like, if this person dangerously or recklessly set out to drive in a way that was likely to cause danger, and did so for a prolonged period of time, that is much more likely to be someone who needs to be put in prison. So one way that could possibly be done is to say that a court can infer a dangerous state of mind from the manner of the driving. In other words, if it looks dangerous, it is dangerous unless the driver can give some alternative explanation, a bit of a reverse burden of proof. There are legal pitfalls for that, but it might work. And the advantage of that solution is that, as I say, it creates a much greater alignment between the offence, is it reckless or is it careless, and the likely sentence, reckless equals jail, careless equals non-custodial driving ban. That would be the generalized assumption. The alternative, as I say, is to redefine the objective definitions that we currently have, so that it's we lose this idea that it's below or far below the standard of a careful and competent driver. How far is far below? How far is and what is the standard of a careful and competent driver anyway? So we could relate that all to either the driving test, would it cause you to be automatically fail, or to the highway code. And we could say, actually, was that breach of the highway code or a failure to driving in a way that would cause a failure in your driving test? That could be careless driving, but it's dangerous if it's done in a situation that was done that caused. If it was done in a situation that caused danger, that would have been obvious to a careful and competent driver. So there are two broad approaches, and there are legal pros and cons to both, and I just want that debate to happen as part of this wider review. Okay, so that's the complicated bit, but I think it's fairly obvious that the distinction between careless and dangerous and the associated penalties, and particularly the use of driving bans, needs to be part of the review. Okay. Other things that I think need to be on the list, if we're going to make greater use of driving bans, then it is really important that drivers shouldn't be able to evade driving bans anything like as easily as they can at the moment. As I'm sure many of you are aware, for drivers who get to 12 points on their license, it's all too easy for them to plead that, oh, please don't give me a driving ban, please, magistrate, because it will cause me exceptional hardship in law. And exceptional hardship is granted in about 1 in 5 cases. That is not exceptional. And we've identified cases where a driver avoided a driving ban for a totting up offence, for getting 12 points on their licence, by pleading that they had to take their dog for a walk and the nearest park was a mile away, and therefore that would cause exceptional hardship. And this is nonsense. So we've got to tighten up the definition of exceptional hardship. We've also got to deal with that issue that the petitioners were concerned about, that I mentioned earlier in the Commons. The really weak penalties available for hit and run offences, they're designed really to deal with scratching somebody else's car, not for leaving someone for dead in the road. That clearly needs to be sorted out. But also other things that we haven't really been making so much of noise about. The drink drive limit. Isn't it time that that was lowered to what is the norm for pretty much every other country in Europe, from 0.8 milligrams per litre to 0.5 milligrams per litre? And as I say, to introduce an offence of causing serious injury while drunk or impaired. Lowering the gap, as I mentioned earlier, between the fatal offences and serious injury offences by equally bad driving. That's also on the wish list. What about tackling handheld mobiles? All the evidence says that hands-free mobiles. Using a hand-free mobile is every bit as dangerous as using a handheld mobile. It's the conversation and the attention-draining effect of that conversation, not the physical activity of holding a mobile phone, that causes your attention to wander off the road. Should we be giving police greater powers in some circumstances to confiscate vehicles? That's been done in Canada. I'm really interested to understand that. Under what circumstances could one justify doing that? You can imagine the sort of protests if we were to push for the police to have those powers in too wide a range of circumstances, but there may be a case for doing it in some. Should we be making greater use of technology to prevent people from, alcohol interlocks or some things like that, to prevent drunk drivers from getting back in the cars? There is a whole range of things that we could add to the scope of the review. The trade-off is the more we add to the scope of the review, the greater the energy we have to expend on winning the arguments, and we might want to just focus on a few things that really, really, really matter. So there's a bit of a trade-off between kind of, volume of what we want and importance of what we want. So all of this is to be debated. And, as I say, I'll be having this conversation with the motoring organisations as well as our allies. But at this point, it's time I opened up for your thoughts and reflections. So that's really the question that's on my mind. Any answers? I'm all ears.
Thanks so much, Roger. And if people want to speak, if you could put your hands up, I'll get round people. And I think the question that Roger posed there is a really good one. He summarised a kind of list of things that they're thinking of putting in. Perhaps a response, people's responses could be, is there anything missing that you thought should have been on that list? Or what are the most important things that he raised? Because, you know, if it's a question of picking 3 or 4, what do you think the most important things to focus on are? So perhaps, you know, you can say anything you want in your response, but those are key questions that he's wrestling with. So go to Derek and then Ruth.
Thanks very much, Roger. That was amazingly comprehensive. I just am fascinated by reckless and careless and the distinction. I use video cameras on my bike, and sometimes I don't report people because I watch them go down the road and they generally behave in a sort of decent fashion, give other cyclists a wide berth, and maybe they were just too close to me for a moment. And that was a sort of moment of carelessness. And I guess my feeling about recklessness is stuff has gone on before and after the incident that would shed light on the state of mind of the driver. I just wonder if Roger had a thought on that.
Yes, I think what would, you probably wouldn't write that into statute law. What you'd probably say is you write into statute law that the court can infer the state of mind of the driver from the manner of the driving, and then you kind of get it written into prosecution guidance that the sort of point you're making, that the things that a court can infer as indicative of a reckless state of mind would either be prolonged a breach of the standard of driving, whether it's the highway code or the driving test standard, or a grossly excessive breach. So speeding way above the limit and or for a prolonged time, either of those things, or talking on the mobile for a long, you know, you can see what I mean. Either prolonged or grossly excessive would be indicative of a very reckless state of mind.
Thanks, Roger.
If other people have any questions for Roger, I'll sort of take a couple so that he can think about them. But while you're all thinking, in the meantime, Ruth.
Hi, Roger. Thanks very much. I got my first letter from Ruth Cadbury, Robert Jenrick in 2014 about road danger. So as you know, I've been on this for a very long time. Prison sentences, I volunteer for the Youth Offending Service, and we have a lot of kids who've taken mopeds and use them recklessly and can cause injury. And they don't get custodial sentences because that would lead them on a path of being in prison. And therefore it's better to have reparation, that kind of stuff. But for older people or other people who drive unsafely, my mind always goes back to the case of Mr. Mason, who was killed in Regent Street, and the woman got away with it simply by saying, I didn't see him. Now, saying I didn't see him, to me, really is dangerous driving, because if you can't see someone, you know, a metre in front of you, you shouldn't be on the road and you shouldn't be driving. So I just wondered, you know, things, we all talk about SMIDC, but whether this whole excuse of I didn't see to get people off, if that sort of needs looking at maybe for a discussion rather than to be part of your asks. Thank you.
Yes.
Roger, do you want to come back on that point?
Sorry, I thought we were about to go on and do a little wrap up of points. Sorry, my apologies. Yeah.
Yeah, Ruth's point was, you know, should we get rid of the I didn't see defence?
Sorry, I didn't. Sorry, I didn't see you. I think the point is,
it's also negligent
either way. I think the question is, you know, if you, whichever way you do it, yes, failure to see is something that is a breach of either the highway code or the driving test. Failing to see someone and then hitting them would undoubtedly cause an automatic fail of the driving test. The question is whether, so either way, yes, we would eliminate that defence. The question is, do we want to accept that that is careless, i.e. that your state of mind wasn't as it were, a reckless state of mind, and therefore we don't necessarily want to send that driver to prison? Or do we want to say, well, actually, it's dangerous because it caused dangerous that would be obviously foreseeable, and therefore avoid all the pitfalls of having to try and prove a state of mind, but accept that some dangerous offences will not result in custody. Does that make sense? Either way, agree with your points. The question is, how do we reassure jurors that that doesn't necessarily mean custody?
Very quickly, just to include in that is this thing about low sun, because somebody got away with someone recently with driving into the sunshine, and that's often, and that's used as an excuse. Whereas if you're driving safely, it doesn't matter how low the sun is, you should be driving according to the speed. Thank you.
And that too would be driving too fast for the conditions. That too would be a breach of either of those tests: the highway code test or the driving test failure. Either way, driving too fast into the sun, you're in breach of it.
Stephen Edwards, over to you.
Yeah, I know it's really fascinating, really useful, this subject of behaviour change, but I just wondered about linking it back to infrastructure. And I saw a tweet. I see occasionally these tweets. Saw one today. Somebody said, if I get killed by a motorist, I certainly don't want it reported as killed by a car. The point was being hit by a car rather than a motorist. But what they wanted to do was make sure that everyone who saw their tweet challenged the council or whichever authority to make the change necessary to ensure that that didn't happen again. So that's slightly off the track of what we're talking about, but I wonder if there's any way of linking back into what we're fighting for to make sure, I don't know, a highway authority of wherever makes an actual physical change. Is that maybe it's not on top?
Can I just there are various other processes that are going on alongside the road. I mean, there's going to be a lot road safety related stuff is going to be high on my priority list for the year ahead. It's not just the road traffic offences and penalties stuff. There's also a roads policing review that we're awaiting. We know that the government consulted on that. We're still waiting for the outcomes. They are also supposed to be coming up with a road safety statement. We're not sure what the process and timescales are, but they're also looking at setting up a road collision investigation board. Now, there have been road accident, I know the word accident, road accident investigation, sorry, there's been a rail accident investigation branch, a maritime and an aviation air accident investigation branch for a long time. And the rail investigation branch has been incredibly incredibly effective. You'll remember that spate of rail accidents, Clapham Common, Potters Bar, you name the list. And suddenly they stopped happening from about 2 years after the rail investigation board was set up and running. The government is finally looking at setting up something for road. The difficulty it's going to have is there are so many more road near misses. So to investigate near misses on the road with the same intensity that the rail accidents are investigated would be a massive, it would require huge organisation with huge resources. So it's going to have to prioritise somehow. But the point is, they are going to be looking thematically at whether different types of collision, different types of road user, different types of road user behavior, different types of infrastructure, different types of junction, different times of day, what kind of solutions, whether it's a legislative or a behavior change solution or an infrastructure design solution, changes to guidance, all of those things are going to be in scope for the road collision investigation branch once it's set up and running. So I think I'd rather push that one towards what we say to the government's process of defining the road collision investigation branch rather than the offences and penalties process. They're both going to be going on this year.
Yeah. Thanks for the question, Stephen, and thanks, Roger. We've got 2 minutes left, and Dave, if you can ask your question in 10 seconds, I'll allow it.
Well, I'll get my bête noire. Section 39, Roger. We need Section 39. It's the poorest law out. It says it's basically poachers are gamekeepers.
That's 10 seconds. Over to you, Roger. Section 39. What's the answer?
39. I'm pretty sure you're talking about the duty on local authorities to investigate. Am I right, Dave? Just briefly nod or shake. Yes, right. So I think the point is that I relate that to the investigation branch. The point is that the investigation branch is going to do more thematic investigations. The feedback should feed into what local authorities do. I absolutely agree that local authorities need a duty to look at specific cases, and the question of how the police's role, how the local authorities' role, and how this investigation branch's role, how do they all dovetail with one another? That's going to be crucial.
Okay, thank you, Roger. Right, well, before we finish, I'm going to hand to Ruth for the last word, but my takeaway, Roger, that I would like to summarise is that it's brilliant that we've got someone like yourself kind of leading on this and look out for what comes out as part of the sort of campaign. I think the overall point is that the scandalous way that people who cause terrible injury and death on the roads, fundamentally that needs addressing. So you'll figure out the best way to do that in this review. But you know that we are in a very bad position at the moment, aren't we? So, and
if I can just say, if you have any thoughts after this session, roger.geffen@cyclinguk.org, and I'll post that in the chat. Okay, that
would be brilliant. So do feel free. You know, Roger's given us a great briefing tonight, so feel free to post your thoughts through to him. And Roger will be back next week to talk about the highway code, which is very topical because the changes come in at the end of January. So that's handy. And now over to Ruth for our last word tonight.
Thanks, Claire. Thanks, everyone. Happy New Year again. Yes, so Roger, my last word really is going to be an intro to your talk for next week, because we know that the country has a proliferation of give way signs on every side road, even driveways, entrances to factories, entrances to everywhere, anywhere. The new highway code should say that those now are null and void, and therefore there may be crashes, accidents, because drivers will presume right away. So the question, last word, is can we talk about this issue of give way signs? And I've got some very good photographs for next week. And that is the last word.